Florida PDMP. This is lesson 22 on the Florida PDMP program, also known as eForce. And this will cover pages 109 through 113 in your book, and this will be the last lesson for the controlled substance chapter. So every state now has a prescription monitoring program or prescription drug monitoring program. So you might hear the acronyms PMP or PDMP. I think Missouri was the last state who didn't have one. I think they finally got one. So I think all states have this. These programs vary from state to state, but they're a good source of questions on the MPJE no matter what state you're going to. So if you're going to another state, always look up the PMP or PDMP requirements and make sure you review those. As I mentioned, the program in Florida is called eForce. It stands for Electronic Florida Online Reporting of Controlled Substances and Evaluation. The rules for the PDMP program in Florida are actually not in the Board of Pharmacy regulations or section, because the rules apply to the prescribers as well as the dispensers, the pharmacies. So it's run by the Florida Department of Health, which is the overall agency that all the healthcare boards fall under. So these rules are actually found in Chapter 64K1 of the Florida Administrative Code, if you want to read the entire rules, whereas all the other pharmacy rules, as you'll see in the next couple of chapters, the next couple of lessons after we get out of controlled substances, are 64B16, or those are all the chapters for the Board of Pharmacy. This is the one instance where you got to maybe look outside of the pharmacy rules to understand it, but I've got a nice summary of it here, so hopefully this will cover what you need to know. Obviously, the purpose of these rules is to collect all the prescribing of controlled substances to look for patients that are doctor shopping or pharmacy shopping or potentially abusing controlled substances. The issue with the PDMP programs are there are a lot of privacy concerns about that, so we'll talk about some of the confidentiality and privacy concerns and requirements that go along with it. And then a lot of these PDMP programs are actually connected between the different states, so they're not isolated. So states, because patients would go from one state to another to try to avoid being tracked. So NABP has something called the PMP Interconnect, and the Florida system is part of that, and it allows you to query even prescriptions that are filled in other states as well. So Florida is a little bit unique, I think. Not a lot of states have this, and they've got requirements that make the PDMP use mandatory, both for prescribers and pharmacists. There are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, it's required each time a controlled substance is being dispensed from the pharmacy or is being prescribed by the practitioner. The reason I say that's unique is a lot of physicians don't like that. Physicians don't like to be told what to do and limit their prescribing and so forth. So when this has come up in other states, the physician groups oftentimes are able to fight off that legislation. But it got passed in Florida, so it is mandatory. But there are quite a few exceptions that we'll talk about. On the pharmacy side, that means that you have to check the PDMP for both new prescriptions and anytime there's a refill of a controlled substance prescription as well. So what are the exceptions when checking the PDMP is not required? Those are listed for you on page 110, and it includes for patients under the age of 16, for hospice patients, for non-narcotic Schedule 5 drugs. I actually had to do a little bit of research to find out what are the non-narcotic Schedule 5 drugs, and the ones I came up with are listed for you there on page 110. I think one of them is no longer on the market, actually. Obviously, if the system is down, the system's not working and not operational, then you don't have to check it. But interestingly enough, on the top of page 111, it says that if that's the situation and either the prescriber or the pharmacy can't check the PDMP for some reason, then they have to document that, and they can only prescribe or dispense not more than a 3-day supply of a controlled substance in that situation. So that's kind of a unique thing, and that's something they can definitely ask you about. Okay, so remember, you have to check the PDMP mandatory except for one of those exceptions. And you also have to report into the PDMP every time you dispense a controlled substance. So you need to know what the reporting requirements are on page 111. I find this to be one of those things that pharmacists don't have to worry about in practice because it's all automated, right? It's all done by by your pharmacy computer system. But guess what? What happens on the MPJE? The MPJE wants to make sure that you read the regulations and know when it's got to be done, who doesn't have to do it. Do you have to file 0 reports? And actually, what information actually gets transmitted to the PMP? You got to know all those details. So the Florida rules say that you have to report the dispensing of a controlled substance to the eForce system no later than the next business day after the product was dispensed. There are some extensions you can get and so forth that you can read about on number 2 on page 111. There are some people who are exempt from reporting. So the administration of a drug, like in a hospital, doesn't have to be reported. We're talking about outpatient dispensing here. Also dispensing in Department of Corrections and prisons. We had that, remember, even looking at the PMP for patients under the age of 16 is not required, and also dispensing to patients under the age of 16, you don't have to report that as well. You can get an exemption if your pharmacy doesn't dispense any controlled substances. This is letter 3D on page 111, and that might be helpful for, let's say, a nuclear pharmacy that's never good, that doesn't dispense any controlled substances. If they want to get a complete exemption, you have to renew that every 2 years when you renew your pharmacy permit. If you don't dispense a lot of controlled substances, you do have to file a 0 report that says I didn't dispense any in the previous day. So even if you did dispense any, you don't just skip a day. The system's going to be looking for your report, so you have to submit a 0 activity report the next business day to show that you didn't dispense any controlled substances the previous day. If there's some type of error or you need to correct something that was submitted in the reporting to the PDMP program, that's got to be done within 1 business day of when your submission was provided. So make sure you take note of that on the bottom of page 111. Then over on page 112, it shows you the actual information that's got to be transmitted to the PDMP program. And again, you don't worry about this in practice, but they could ask you on the MPJE, you know, what information is transmitted. I think it's interesting that the method of payment, was it cash or insurance, is something that's got to be provided, as well as not just the name of the drug, but the actual NDC number of the actual drug that was dispensed, whether or not it was initial or a refill prescription. The name of the person who picked up the prescription and the type of identification provided. That one's kind of interesting because remember they said that if they are known to you or they have insurance and it was adjudicated, then you don't have to get a specific ID. So I'm not sure why they would require the type of ID provided. I guess if it's an insurance patient, you would just put insurance or adjudicated or something like that. But again, this is the type of thing that you don't worry about in practice, and the study tip tells you there, but for MPJE purposes, I think you need to kind of look at that list. And a lot of it's common sense, but kind of memorize that list to the extent possible. The other thing that comes up with PMP programs is access and privacy, because this is highly sensitive data. When these laws are passed to implement these PMP programs, there's always a lot of protections for the information. So only pharmacists and prescribers can register to have access to the PMP program. Now, you can appoint a designee to access the PMP on your behalf, like a pharmacy technician, but there are rules on how you do that. But really, it's your responsibility as a pharmacist to check the PMP. It's not the technician's job to do that. Remember, you're responsible when you designate someone like a technician to access the PMP, you're still responsible for those actions. Remember, this is sensitive data, so you can only access this data to actually look up a patient that you have. What you don't want to do is go look up the PDMP if some famous person dies of an overdose, and I say that because this happens every time that happens. Every time some famous person dies of a drug overdose, we hear stories about pharmacists in that state looking up their profile in the PDMP to see what they were taking and how much they were taking, and you can and will be disciplined if you do that, so please do not do that. The other thing, and we mentioned this earlier, is law enforcement agencies do not have direct access to the PDMP. And remember, if they come up and ask you to print something out of the PDMP program, out of the eForce program, you should politely decline that request, okay? But don't forget, they can ask for a summary report of your dispensing records out of your dispensing system, not from the PDMP program, but from your dispensing system. They do have the authority to ask for that. So it's kind of a way of getting around that that you can't provide them access to the PDMP program. And besides that, you can politely decline if they ask for information from the PDMP program and tell them that they can request access to the PDMP data, but directly from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. I'm sorry, not the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, the Florida Department of Health, who runs the PDMP program. If they have an active investigation, they can request data from the PDMP, but they can't get it from your pharmacy. Okay, that is the end of this lesson, and also the end of a very important chapter on controlled substances, chapter 2 in your book. The next lessons will start with chapter 3, and we'll talk specifically about Florida laws in both chapter 3 and chapter 4.